What I wanted to discuss today was just my own sort of struggle or meanderings through my own field in quantum mechanics and seeing how that meshes or interfaces with the truth claims in the Bible about Christianity and the nature of God. And so this is not just quantum mechanics, but also how it may impact or how we understand this with a philosophical background and a theological background as well. And so who am I and why should anybody care? I teach physical chemistry and also forensic chemistry. And it's an interesting combination because both of them emphasize how we know things. You weren't at the crime scene, so you can't actually go there and repeat the crime and see how it played out. We do have some sort of crime scene reenactments or reconstructions, but it's not an empirical science necessarily. But in physical chemistry, we can't get down to the quantum level. It'd be nice if Ant-Man and Wasp were real. You could zoom down and see things on the quantum level. And it was funny because in that movie, if you're familiar with Ant-Man and Wasp, where the guy was frustrated and said, "Yeah, just put quantum in front of everything." And they both said, yeah, pretty much. And I felt the same way. I'm also a theological mutt. So I've got sort of grew up in the Episcopal Church, and college was in the Baptist Church. Early on, my wife and I attended a Methodist church and now a Lutheran church. So been in sort of in conversation with a lot of people from different theological backgrounds. And then I'm late to the philosophy club, but learning. And so that's why I love to interact with Ken and sort of refine how I talk about things from a philosophical standpoint. And so all of this figures into my use of the phrase consistent with. So I want to look at the data and the truth claims in the Bible and see if the data in the world that we see around us is consistent with what Scripture teaches us about God. And so you won't see me say prove, but you'll see me say consistent with. And so as a forensic example was the suspect at the scene of the crime. This suspect dated the victim, had a key, owned a murder weapon, had blood on his shoe, did not have an alibi, and fought recently with the deceased. These are sort of the facts of the matter. And, other suspects may possess some of these attributes. The victim dated other people, perhaps. There's, billions of people with no alibi. But yet we would say all of these attributes are consistent with the claim that this suspect was at the scene of the murder. We have a similar thing in reality. The way the world works is the Christian God consistent with what we see around us. We have a world that has objective morality built into it. Even if we deny that, we really don't live that way. And so if someone were to deny objective morality, see what happens when their paycheck is short. And they say, wait a second, that's not right. And so children are the first to claim that's not fair. They have the Big Bang, finely tuned universe, just math. I would say the knowability of the universe. That's sort of I put math in that category. We have mind and soul. We have actually some very compelling evidence of what they call remote viewing. You may have heard of this, where people have seen things. The near-death experience whole idea is a little shaky in terms of what they see in the afterlife that we cannot necessarily test. But when they say, I was outside in this, leaving the hospital and there's a shoe on the roof, and this person has never been on the roof, and you go up and see that there's a shoe on the roof, that's an interesting fact that needs to be dealt with. So that's an interesting situation. We also have the prophecy. So I just put Isaiah in that, and then Jesus. So these are facts in what we call the world, and quantum mechanics is in that same realm. And is it consistent with God? And so it reveals some strange properties of reality. And I think a lot of times it's used to make people nervous about their faith. It's used also to do what I call witch doctorism, where they say, here's some confusing things about quantum mechanics that you don't understand, but I understand. And therefore, I will tell you these other pronouncements, and you've got to just take my word for it because I'm smarter than you. And I don't like that use of quantum mechanics. So the question today is the God of the Bible consistent with the findings of quantum mechanics? Is this another circle that we can say as evidence of our suspect? And so there's a lot of information about quantum on the Reason's website. If you just search quantum, you get 16 pages of hit results. So this is a great place to go if you want to learn what's going on.
Just on our website?
Yes.
Really?
And so that's the whole thing. That's today's new reasons to believe, and a lot of little short posts, but blog posts as well. So everything, and I went to the 16th page and it was still relevant. You know, sometimes the relevancy drops off, but it was 16 pages that had something to say about quantum.
And our search engine doesn't find everything either.
Yeah, so it's well covered. And so the simple quantum mechanics, this view of a violin string, this is actually the beginning of quantum wave mechanics. De Broglie, he was a lover of classical music, and he was thinking about the results of light interacting with matter, and trying to come up with a mechanism, a way to understand how you can have quantum jumps in energy. What's in between? Why do we not have any energy available to these atomic scale particles, but only certain energies available? And he thought of this string analogy where you have a boundary condition, and that boundary condition sets up certain resonant waves. And so this was his analogy that he wrote in his thesis, and Schrodinger picked that up and then put the mathematics behind it. So we end up with this quantum jumping. We have particles in states that jump to other states. And this is a figure from a book project that I'm working on, teaching quantum mechanics into one dimension. So essentially a string model that you can then explain light interacting with matter. I'm not going to go through that whole thing. That's a totally different talk. But just looking at all of the possibilities, the ones on the left here are absorption, stimulated emission, and spontaneous emission, and the ones on the right are scattering phenomena like Raman scattering and Rayleigh scattering. And so this darned quantum jumping was what drove Erwin Schrodinger crazy. In 1926, he visited Bohr and Heisenberg in Copenhagen, and they were irritated by Schrodinger's wave mechanics because they argued against the need for a mechanical view of the quantum world. They thought math was enough, that it was just a formalism. If we can explain the results with math, we're fine, we're done. We don't need to think that there's a reality at the atomic level that is as concrete as a billiard ball. And in fact, the energy levels were easily explained, easily with a question mark, by the mechanics, but the mysterious quantum jumping remains a mystery to this day. We don't have a good mathematical way to describe when a photon will excite an atom or an electron, or when that atom or electron will de-excite and spontaneously spit out a photon. So this jumping remains, and that was what Schrodinger said, if all this quantum jumping were really here to stay, I should be very sorry I got involved, because it just drove him crazy that there was no cause for these events. And that's where this causality question comes. And it's still an open question as to what causes light and these wave functions to interact, when that happens, and then what happens. And so they came up with this over time, this Copenhagen interpretation, and it's philosophy laden. So buried inside this interpretation, you see the influence of the logical positivists, what they call the Vienna Circle. There's several philosophers, including Bertrand Russell and one of his students, a staunch atheist. And then you had Ernst Mach and Boltzmann and Einstein as a part of this philosophical school that essentially claimed, number one here, properties of atomic systems do not exist prior to being measured. And that's a very positivist take on it. That's saying they do not exist. That's an ontological statement, saying there's no. Now, an epistemological version would be properties at the atomic scale are not known until they're measured. So see this difference between ontology and epistemology. Is it just something we don't know and can't describe? Or is it something that doesn't exist? Well, then you're talking about the very base of reality, because you can take every particle in the universe and reduce it down to its wave function. So you're saying that the wave functions don't exist until they're measured? That's a tough sell, yes.
So I just heard a paper and discussion on this last week, and actually, yeah, last week. So with these two ideas, the ontological claim and the epistemological claim, would they coincide with the indeterminate
Yes.
and the determinate?
Well, we'll get to indeterminacy in the next. There's like 3 points to this Copenhagen. Yeah, but this would be indeterminate. The initial state. So I've shown the states on the right, like over here. Yeah, I've got a pointer. You know, you could think of it as I don't know if this molecule is in its ground state or its excited state until I do the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one ramification of this. If I do the experiment and I see the result, then I could say, well, that system was in this previous state. I would essentially be using the epistemological version, saying it was in the ground state, I didn't know it. The ontological state would say it's in both states and you've caused it to collapse into one or the other by doing the experiment. And so then that's part 2 is quantum mechanics can only predict the probability distribution of many measurements. So I can't tell you what one particular atom or electron will do, but I can tell you very confidently what the population will give. And so that's indeterminacy as well. You know, I can't for this particular atom tell you what will happen, but I can tell you of an ensemble of atoms what the average is going to be. And we have countless physical devices that we use every day. Laser pointers, thermal, infrared thermometers. We can point at our air conditioner vents and it's looking at the black body curve, which is an ensemble effect. And it can tell you what temperature that screen is at. We can measure the temperature of the atmosphere using the rotational bands of CO2. It's totally easy to do. But a particular CO2 molecule, I would not be able to tell you what state it's in until I measured it. And it'd be difficult to measure one at a time. Although they have single molecule spectroscopy. It's pretty amazing. Yes. And then 3 and 4 are the observer effect and wave function collapse. And this is where non-locality comes in. So the act of measuring affects the system. And then part 4 is causing the set of probabilities. So there's a set of probabilities that could happen to collapse into a particular result. So this idea of agency comes in where you're choosing how to test the system. And then your act of testing causes this to collapse. All these probabilities, there's a set of possible outcomes. It collapses into a particular outcome. And this allows us to demonstrate some very weird experiments. Early on, they called it spooky action at a distance. So let's talk about that. And this was a great video. It was actually this most recent episode of 2819 that came out where Erica Carlson's talking about heads or tails and this indeterminacy in the quantum measurement issue. Oops, it didn't play. Let's go back one. Do you have a back button?
Yeah, you should be able to click on it. We'll play it.
Well, I want to go back one.
Yeah.
So let me right click.
Let's see.
Maybe I've got it back previous. Here we go. Yeah, so I clicked on it and it went to the next screen. So
Go back
go back.
and then try.
Are there any controls?
Yeah, I was gonna say hover down at the bottom. Nope, that didn't work. Maybe try right clicking on the screen. Is there a play button?
No.
Maybe up at the top.
Did you embed the slide when you put it up? I did embed it, yeah. Essentially, she talks about you spin a quarter on the tabletop and ask if it's heads or tails. And it's almost a nonsensical question because it's not defined. It hasn't flattened out to where one side is pointing up. And that's what you would define as a head or a tail. She said, but as it's spinning, you say, is it heads or tails? You're asked the question, but you're not interacting with it. You're not actually taking the measurement. When you smack it down and then look, that's taking the measurement. And so it was a 50-50 chance of being a head or a tail, but when you make the measurement, those two options collapse into one definite result. And so that's a simple example of the measurement causing or revealing the particular result for that quantum indeterminate state. The spooky action at a distance comes in with quantum entanglement. We have certain phenomena where particles come out and they're spin paired. And so they come out, they travel some distance. And if you measure one, say it's a spinning quarter, you smack it down, it says heads, the other one is going to be tails. And it instantly collapses into that situation, which requires, because of the distance involved, communication that's faster than the speed of light. And that's what's spooky about it. So this is caused all kinds of interesting studies to be done. It's difficult to nail down the detector and the measurement conditions and so on, so that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. But they've shown that either reality or locality are up for grabs here. And that's where the philosophical and the theological questions come in. Also, it shows with the Bell's theorem and his inequality that hidden or unknown variables seem to be ruled out. So this is a video. If you do get a copy of the talk, you can look at these two embedded videos and they'll help. But this unknown variable is that, okay, they have a definite answer, heads or tails. We just don't know it yet. So that's the epistemological interpretation. And as soon as we measure one, because we know this one, we know that one. And so there's no time needed for that, because they were heads and tails all the time. We just didn't know it yet. But Bell's inequality rules that out. It's against the empirical interpretation. So the empirical interpretation is difficult to support with Bell's inequality theorem. And yet this distance involved, what possible process can explain non-locality faster than light interaction of particles? That seems to be the universal speed limit on physical processes. And so this is where both scientists and philosophers have waded in the struggle with faster than light phenomenon. Some have proposed a near infinite set of parallel universes where all non-observed probabilities are actual, not just potential, so that these other universes exist. And then when you make a measurement, you measure this spin paired set of quarters, this one is heads. You've selected the situation or the universe where that's heads and the other's tails. If you selected a different universe, this would be tails and the other heads. But this becomes a very philosophically laden proposition, that we have infinite universes that are actual, and you're able to choose one or the other every time you make a quantum measurement.
So just out of curiosity, how many different systems or confirmations of this spooky effect at a distance have actually been reported? Are they?
That's a good question.
Can we see them all the time if we're working in a particular system? Do we see them occasionally in multiple different types of systems?
I would have to pull the particular papers on that. But this video does describe it, and it has some of the citations in the video that you could pause the video and see the papers that they're talking about. And this video is, I think, it's by 1 Minute Physics.
Most of those are things that we've engineered. We don't see a lot of those just in nature, do we?
Well, if you think of one example that I can think of is the spin pairing of like an electron-positron annihilation, that those two gamma rays are generated and they're going off in opposite directions, and that their spins are paired with each other. And so they can go quite a distance, both at the speed of light. So, I mean, very soon their distance is farther than the speed of light could take, a communication channel. They're both going in opposite directions at the speed of light. You test one, you know something about the other. And so this is common technology. Not that we're testing those spins all the time.
That could have been a generative effect at the point of origin, right?
That's what the Bell inequality is trying to test.
Okay.
Yes, and so that's a very good video for that kind of question, in terms of, that's the hidden variable. So the hidden variable will be that they were spin paired and that they always had that spin, and we detected one, so we know the other.
Right.
And that's the hidden variable. That's a variable we don't know that has connected these two. And that's what Bell's inequality theorem is trying to either support or deny. Yeah. And it does seem that the hidden variables are ruled out.
Okay.
Yes. And so so that leaves us with non-locality.
Or at least they're below some threshold of our being able to
Well, it's a very clever inequality the way it's set up, and essentially what I see it as, it's confirming the math that's related to quantum entanglement of these wave functions. And there's other videos that I've watched trying to understand these experiments, and they say if there were hidden variables, these are what the results would look like. If they're entangled and there's spooky action at a distance, this is what the experiments would look like. And it's very clear that the quantum entanglement math works. Now, how to interpret that math is the question. And so the struggle is, how do we explain non-locality? One is multiple universes, but then that's not the only option. That may be the only option for an atheist. But if the science hints of a larger, I say once again, because again, with initial inflation of the Big Bang, that's hinting at a different physics. And so many have said that, this hints at multiple universes. Once again, with spooky action at a distance, is this again hinting at some other reality? Could these potential universes indicate a spiritual realm? What makes them physical, right? And then God may react also instantaneously to our active choices to measure the system in a particular way. I'm not saying this is proof. I'm saying, again, it's consistent with, if this is a data point, is God's existence consistent with that data point? And I believe it is.
God would be like the local variable, just undetectable?
Yeah, undetectable, or not necessarily a local variable, but ability to react to our agency. So we make a choice, and he's able to interact to make it happen. So it's a little bit of formatting issues, but so there's three bottom lines that I have from this. One is that agency exists. We have a choice in how we affect the universe. We can set up our experiments. We can choose to force electrons to behave like waves in this experiment, or behave like particles in a different experiment. Photoelectric effect, particle nature of electrons. Diffraction experiment, wave nature of electrons. And our agency flows from our being made in the image of God. I was trying to find a place for agency in the scripture, and it's not that easy. I mean, maybe I would love to have input from anybody else that has good verses for our agency, but even at the very beginning, God said, Adam, you name the animals, you tend the garden. He gave agency to us by being made in his image. He has agency, and so do we.
Actually, one of the explanations for this, for Bell's inequalities, is complete determinism, where there's no agency whatsoever, that the entire universe is fixed, including our choices, okay, and that it's all consistent.
And how can that, I've heard that too, but I don't see the logic of that. How do they justify that?
Because our choices are fixed and known, that the particles essentially know what our choices are. You know, that it's, you can put together an entire system that is consistent in that way. That there is no delayed choice because we have no choice. It's already determined. Everything's fixed.
I've heard that, but I haven't heard the support for it. I don't know how they support that. I mean, I can cause this heads or tails wave function to collapse, but I cannot tell you what it will be.
Take a look, think of the universe as a movie, okay, where everything is already there and fixed, okay, and it's all consistent. There's no agency in a movie. No one can make another choice.
Right.
Okay, and so your choice is known, and your choice, therefore, the particles already know. You're basically taking time out of the system.
That seems to have a consistency with kind of a God's eye view of the universe, you know, that we look at things as though time is unfolding and our choices are free and unknown until they happen, you know, but God sitting outside would, I mean, not that he's watching a movie, but it's all done and known. Is that the sort of thing they're arguing for? Something consistent with that or not?
Yes. Most people, I don't know of anyone who takes this seriously, but it is a solution to the problem. And so that causes trouble with your bottom line number one.
Yes.
That it exists, because in fact the exact opposite is a possible conclusion.
Let's look at bottom line number two. God's sovereignty also is supported by this, in the sense that if we do not observe or impact all of the other quantum events in nature, what turns the potential universe into the actual universe?
Yeah, I've got a number of books in my office that are actually addressing this, but they're also trying to explain not only the quantum world, but human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And basically they're saying there is no free will, everything's
Right,
predetermined.
Right.
And so that's kind of their way of trying to explain not only the quantum world, but this
Yes.
inability in their part to explain human consciousness. They're
Right.
basically saying that we are not conscious.
Mm-hmm.
It's just pure predetermination all the way.
What gets me is many of those folks were operating from a mechanical, material
Exactly.
view.
Right.
But when we get down to the wave function, it ceases to be mechanical.
Well, and our behavior ceases to be
Yes.
predetermined.
And so that's what I'm saying, that these experiments are set up. You decide what angle you put the polarizer at.
Well, I also
You
think-
decide, how to set up the experiment. You are choosing whether, again, the easiest example is whether you choose to measure the wave properties of an electron or the particular properties of an electron. I mean, if you have no choice, let me just use a practical example. If you have no choice, you have no science. The basis of science is evaluating the evidence and making a choice on what you find most compelling. You're not doing any of that in a mechanistic world.
There's a question of whether people are being consistent or not, but if the idea is that you have this perception of a choice, but the
Mhm.
reality of it is your choice is already determined,
Mm-hmm.
then I can see where that all fits together
Yes.
coherently.
And I think it fits together too. That's why I'm saying it's consistent with it. None of this has violated the Christian worldview, in my opinion. Let me look at the third one: cooperation and direction. We see, and again, I was running short on time, so that's why you just have a text blast on these. But God in His infinite wisdom does allow our free choices, our agency in our small sphere of influence, but still orchestrate His sovereign will outside of our sphere of influence. And we see all kinds of verses that support, again, his sovereignty, His understanding of the heavens, His participation in those, and His sustaining ability. If it takes an observer to cause this quantum entanglement to collapse, we have an observer. We have an observer that's all omnipresent and all-knowing. We have an observer in our model that can be at all places at once and can make a potential universe an actual. So I think of this, it is consistent with the reality that we see in quantum mechanics. But one thing I think that helps me struggle with this idea of free will versus God's sovereignty is this game of tag I played with some kindergartners. They made every choice freely about which way to go to try to catch me. But I was so much more agile that I could orchestrate their movements without ever touching them. I could take them anywhere in the yard I wanted them to go. I could escape their grasp, yet they were still making free choices. So they had an objective in mind, and they were working to achieve that objective. But then I was also, again, higher than their ways and able to direct their emotions. Now it may be a bad analogy in that it makes us the kindergartners and God playing a game with us, but I don't think life is a game necessarily, but I do think it does hold in the ability for us to have free will and make our choices, and yet His ability to react to those instantaneously, not bound by the speed of light, not bound by location, not bound by anything that we would construct in our universe. So those are my thoughts on this. I think that a lot of mischief is played with quantum mechanics in trying to refute religion. Like you said too, strict determinism. I still haven't seen a good connection between these results and this Copenhagen interpretation leading directly, inexorably to a mechanistic universe where there's no free will. But I do know, I've heard people claim that. And so I'm interested in learning more.
Well, I kind of agree with Jeff here that if you're an atheist, you have to deny free will.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only way to make your atheism consistent. There is no free will.
It's the life of dominoes falling.
Yeah.
Yes.
But does the evidence support that?
I don't think it does. Even at the bottom line, I can knock that quarter down, but I can't tell you what it was. I can't tell you if it's heads or tails until I look. I did not determine that to be a head or a tail. Now, they could say nature did, okay? But does nature now communicate? Does this head communicate to that tail faster than the speed of light? They've got a problem there. They've got a big problem.
No,
Well, no, because it's not, I guess, so there's a number of things rumbling around, so I'm trying to figure out how to articulate them. It's not so much that there's a hidden variables, it's, so in this, everything's determined. It's that I may not be able to determine it, but the sheer, when you look at all of the atoms and everything that are going on and the timing and everything, that there is no choice of what's going to happen. It's beyond our ability to know, but there is no choice, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so in your gamma rays splitting, all of what goes on with forming the gamma rays affects, is encoded in the rest of the universe. And so everything's just kind of flowing out and following this plan. I could see how that plays out. And there's a part to where, that sits far more comfortably with the sovereignty of God, that is just kind of everything's happening the way it is. I guess what a question I'm having is, as a Christian, what would I expect the answer to this to be? Mm-hmm. Because, it seems like the hidden my inclination is that there's some sort of hidden variable back there.
Yes.
Granted, that Bell's theorem kind of argues against it, but there's going to be something like that that's the answer there. Mm-hmm. But it's not clear to me that that's the one that it counts for the theological sophistication of how God interacts with creation. And I guess I'm just wrestling with, as a Christian, what would I expect the answer to be? Right. Very often my initial answer isn't as comprehensive as what I need it to be to actually. And this
talk looks, it looks better on PowerPoint than it is in my head.
That's fair.
Okay. You got to write something down. So when you put it in black and white, you're sort of making it seem like you're concrete on these conclusions. But this is just what I've been musing about. And where else am I going to have this kind of interaction with physicists and philosophers but here?
Well, one thing I've noticed about you're a professor of physical chemistry is when you got undergraduates, they really struggle with this quantum world idea, and they sometimes react against it. But just explaining, if there isn't the hiddenness and the ambiguity of quantum mechanics, you can't have stable atoms and molecules. We need that for life.
Yes.
It's crucial for chemistry to work, that it be quantum. So, and I find that often helps the undergraduate get past their initial, we need this to make life work.
Yes.
So,
and we see, this seems remote because it's so tiny and it's on the atomic scale, but we use it every day. In laser scanners at the grocery store and PET scans at the hospital. We actually use antimatter at the imaging center in Huntsville, Texas. That's just bizarre to me that we have that kind of impact of this strange quantum world, and even antimatter. That seems so exotic to somebody just, thinking about what an anti-electron is. And yet we use that to image our own brains and hearts.
So let me ask my question in a different way. It's often, I think I've heard it from you, and I can't trace down the original quote, but if aliens came down and landed on the White House lawn, that would, destroy all religions or rewrite all the religions, and so there's this sense of, the question being, if there are aliens out there, then clearly Christianity's wrong. and so I could take that approach and say, okay,
Mhm.
any sort of evidence there being aliens out there, that can't be right because Christianity would be wrong. And then you go study and recognize that Christianity is far more theologically sophisticated than that.
Right, right.
And at the end of the day, God can choose to create wherever he did. He created here, he created somewhere else. There's nothing wrong about that, one way or the other. And so I kind of have, scientifically, I don't need to demand an answer. I don't need an answer in order to be consistent.
And that's where I am with this, in a sense.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's that, but then, then there's others, is there a beginning? Could quantum gravity get around a beginning and have the universe be eternal? Well, there are things in scripture that are very hard to reconcile with that. And so I do need, I'm still unknown there. I don't know the answer scientifically, but for Christianity to be true, I actually need this. This is the way it's described in Christianity.
Sure, yes.
Or that's a lot harder conclusion, if you will. And so, my question is, in the area of quantum mechanics, is there anything that Christianity brings to bear? Do we need some sort of hidden variables? Do we need locality? Do we need... Is there anything scripturally that informs this is kind of what we need? Or is it you just go out and you say, you know what, maybe the many worlds interpretation is correct, and there's a vast multiverse? Or do you run into problems? You see the question?
Yeah, I think because going into this, I was convinced that the hidden variable was the way to go, and that there was no spooky action at a distance to speak of. That you just didn't know what those intrinsic spins were, and when you tested one, then you knew what the other one was. And I was convinced by the experiments that said that that the hidden variables were not supported. And so then that pushed me over to non-locality. And then I realized that's not a problem with our God. That's not a problem with an all-powerful and omnipresent being that is sustaining the universe. God's sustaining and power didn't end with the Big Bang. I mean, this is what we mean by God's sustaining power. In him all things hold together. What does that mean if it doesn't mean he's in support of every wave function in the universe?
Well, I like your quote from Isaiah 55, that from a Christian worldview perspective, we should anticipate there's going to be things ambiguous and hidden that we can never uncover.
Right.
So the fact that science reveals that is no surprise at all.
And it isn't a surprise, but it also, it has elevated my view of God's interaction with the world. If he's present at all places in every quantum event, if you will. Now that's, people would say that that's susceptible to a God of the gaps, challenge, and that's fair. But I think that we have in Scripture pointing to God's sustaining activity, and here in science we see that what's sustaining the wave function, what's causing non-local interactions to take place, or what is taking care of those non-local interactions. That's consistent with a sustaining presence in the universe.
I think the root of this apparent mystery is our limited understanding of time.
Yes, that's another option too.
Yeah, my interpretation of quantum mechanics, the one that I like, is called a transaction model.
Okay.
Where there's information, there's if you know the mathematics of quantum mechanics, there's you multiply a wave function times its complex conjugate. And one of those is like a wave traveling forward in time. One is like a wave traveling backward in time.
Okay.
And the transaction model gives those reality that says that, in fact, there's an offer wave and a, what's it called, an acceptance wave or something.
Okay.
These are, in fact, real.
Oh, okay.
And what it means then is that time isn't, the past has reality. Let's put it that way. And if you think about God interacting with the universe as a whole, you kind of have to have that. So maybe this is related to Jeff's question of what do you expect?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you have an atemporal God dealing with a temporal universe, okay, where he's created time itself, okay, and can see all of time, then past has to have a reality and future has to have a reality.
Yeah.
And I think
That
once
was-
you start to picture it that way, you know, spooky action at a distance isn't spooky at all. Okay, it's just that when something emits a photon, it already knows where that photon is going to be absorbed. And so if it's emitting two, it knows where both are being absorbed and can make those consistent.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be consistent.
That sounds like the hidden variable, though.
No, it's not a
That
hidden
last
variable.
statement sounded like a hidden variable.
No, it's not a hidden variable at all. It's simply saying that there's information going forward and backward in time. Okay,
Yes.
that there has to be an entire transaction with all the photons, all the entangled quantum, that has to be consistent before there's an emission. You know, you can put an atom in a cavity that cannot, say, an excited atom in a cavity where the cavity cannot support the wavelength of photon that it wants to emit, and that atom will never emit a photon. Okay, so you can keep it from emitting, and whereas if it were out in the open, it would emit it, you know, very quickly.
Yes.
Okay, so it has to know before it emits where that photon is going to be absorbed. And if it cannot be absorbed, if it cannot propagate, the photon will never be emitted.
I'm curious what Ken's thoughts are on the theological input into that. But can you say that that it never emits a photon, or because the cavity won't absorb it, it just emits it, and it always just gets reabsorbed back into itself?
Is there a difference there?
Yes and no. The mechanism is very different. The outcome is the same.
There's an ontological difference, but not an epistemological difference. Yes.
Yeah.
It may happen, but you wouldn't know it. Yeah.
Darren, I had 3 comments. Could you go back to the slide where you have Christianity accounts for all these phenomena?
Okay.
I think you read, there it is. Yeah.
Okay.
I would call that a cumulative case. I would call that explanatory power and scope.
Mm-hmm.
So Christianity has a lot of power, but look at all the scope of it.
Yes.
And that I think would fit very well into kind of a C.S. Lewis cumulative case type of reasoning. A second point I wanted to make is when I wrote my articles on quantum mechanics and the laws of logic, people often want to move away from measurement, the problems of measurement, and want to begin with mysticism.
Right.
And I tried to argue that under certain experimental conditions, light appears as a wave, under different experimental conditions as a particle. But it's not a wave and a particle and a wave at the same time. It's in a different sense. The last thing I wanted to say is about freedom. Christians have differing ways of defining freedom. I mean, you have a lot of evangelicals today talking about libertarian freedom. So I have the freedom to do or not do. But a classical view of freedom was that we have freedom according to our nature. So sin has affected our nature, and we have freedom in that kind of context. So philosophers would distinguish between hard determinism, which is the determinism that's being talked about here, that it's a physical, materialistic determinism. But soft determinism is a different story. For example, I would say, and this is the example that I use, the issue of nature and nurture. My parents have influenced me incredibly, both by genetically and by the way I lived in their family.
Right.
And I can't get away from that.
No.
And yet I still have kind of a soft determinism in that I'm able to respond to that. So those are some of the theological, philosophical thoughts that run through my mind.
Yeah.
And Ken, when these atheists talk about hard determinism, isn't that where we have the image of God challenge? I mean, if hard determinism is really true, then there is no image of God.
I would argue if you have hard determinism, there's no truth and no way of knowing. It collapses into absurdity. I mean, for somebody to say the universe is determined, well, the thoughts in his mind are determined.
That's right. That's why I was saying you lose science. You lose all thought.
It's inconsistent.
There's no rationality.
You can never offer a defeater of it.
Is that okay? Is that in a substance dualist view? Is that correct? Because could not all of the physical be determined, but yet my mind not be?
Well, if you hold a mind-body dualism, then you have something that's not physical.
Right. No, I agree. Yeah.
You have a spiritual or a mental reality. That spiritual or physical reality is, of course, in union with the physical and material, but since it is not essentially physical, I think you would have a different context. But remember, if our physicality is determined in a hard determinism, then how does the mind affect any of that?
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm just wrestling with, at some level, God has to know everything that's happened, and God's not sitting there watching it unfold or anything. And so there is, in some sense, to where God's looking at that and it's all the way it is, which in some sense is physical determinism, but it's also, so I guess does the statement of a hard physical determinism negate the image of God?
I think compatibilism is soft determinism, not hard determinism.
Right.
And then if you look at some of the statements in Scripture, I mean, in the book of Acts, it says that God from all eternity is going to punish those people who crucified Christ, but God's the one who introduced it. And so in the very same verse, you have choice, responsibility, and sovereignty side by side.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I take what your statement to say, going some sort of hard determinism where everything, all the physical is just played out the way it is, it is really just unfolding in some sort of time, whatever that means, that would be something that would be hard to reconcile with Christian theology.
I think hard determinism is absurd.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Well, every hard determinist I've read denies that there's a dual realm. They can say it's all physical.
Well, I mean, I agree they do, but those are not commensurate state. I mean, one doesn't imply the other, but.
By the way, Paul Davies is the one who said that if a UFO landed on the White House lawn, that would defeat Christianity.
But then there are others who say there are already aliens in the White House.
Well, you might be equivocating there.
That's right. That's a good equivocation. Yeah.
Okay, does that wrap up?
Yeah, that's pretty much, that's.
Very good. That's
Tom
very
or
thoughtful.
Bob, did you have any follow-up comments?
I have one. It comes down to a question which I have been wrestling with. The question is, how does God create the universe? And I see two main possibilities. One is that he creates it linearly, that he lets time unfold and creates sort of as it goes. And the other is that he creates the whole thing, but then he iterates. He goes back and interacts with what we would call the past, in which case the changes would propagate into the future because of natural laws. And that gives two very different pictures of the universe, one being a single universe and the other being, in a sense, a multiverse where you have to ask about what's real. Is it the, is each change that God makes, does that create a new universe? Does the old one still exist because it's in God's past? I don't believe there's any way for us to distinguish between these two ways of creating. I can make scriptural cases for either one. And in fact, Carol and I were just having a discussion, reading one of Ken's books about some of the things about God being unchangeable. And does he change his mind? And as you know, there's scriptures where he says that he's regretted things, and it seems like he's changed his mind, and other scriptures that say that he's unchangeable. And I think we can bring these into consistency with, God having his own timeline, but because he's atemporal to us, from our vantage, he never changes. But from his vantage point, he can regret and change his mind. I don't know. It's something that I struggle with, and I don't have a resolution for. I've been sketching out various articles I could write on this, but I don't know of the value to anyone who's not a physicist, and thinks about these things. So I don't know if it would be of use to write one and post it.
And Tom, I think when you talk about God being unchanging, we need to define that unchangeableness so that God can actually express emotions. Because if you take a really strict definition of unchangeableness, that means God has no emotions.
Right.
And of course, these are hotly debated issues. I mean, many people would say, for example, that when Scripture depicts God as changing his mind, we're being given a description of God in human terms.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
There is an accommodation taking place. Now, with regard to the emotion, it probably depends on what you mean by emotion. But again, the idea that God doesn't respond as humans respond emotionally. So those are hotly debated topics today, because you don't want to go down to an openness view of God where you have actually God ontologically changing. That would be outside of Christianity.
Well, changing by whose measure of time, our measure or God's measure? I think if you recognize that God has to have at least one dimension of time of his own, apart from ours, okay, he's not subject to our timeline. Okay, therefore, he cannot change by our timeline, but he can change within his. And I see that as necessary, because without him having a timeline, he can't act, he can't do things, he can't create.
I wonder about that. That seems, you got to be careful there, because we don't argue that God's got to have some sort of spatial capacity in order to do things. And for all intents and purposes, space and time are the same. So if God created space and God created time, I don't know that we ought to, I don't know how we get to use those to define what he can and can't do.
I agree there. We are restricted in our thinking to, our concepts of space and time. And I'm sure those are inadequate to understand God and God's realm. But I have no other way of thinking about it.
Have you looked into, and again, it was a podcast years ago, so I don't remember the details, but it was on the A and B theories of time, and whether God is outside of time, like a book, in which case he's really not interacting, because even though the author may have written the book, once the book's written, it's written. They don't interact with it. Or the B theory, where they're actually in.
Well, that's exactly the question that I'm raising.
Yeah, and so, and I don't know if it's finished work, but I think William Lane Craig has a book on that time. in God. I don't remember the title. Do you recall?
We
Anybody?
did a podcast on straight thinking about A and B theory,
Okay.
about God being timeless or temporal.
Right.
Tom, I would say this. Now all of these people could be wrong.
There could be a C theory of time.
Yeah, there could be.
All
Or a
of
D.
all of these people could be wrong, but all of the classical theologians, so Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Wesley, etc., and even Eastern church fathers, they all believed that God was timeless. And so God lives in an infinite now. He has no beginning and no past. And that was the classical view of Christianity. Now, that poses problems and challenges.
Mhm.
It seems more like that would be conceptual, a number or an idea rather than a personal God. So that classical view definitely has challenges. But that is the classic view of
Right. I like Hugh's description of calling it time full rather than timeless.
Well, it's interesting, Tom, as I actually did a debate at Cambridge with Bill Craig on this whole issue.
Oh, you did.
Different
Good.
definitions
Okay.
of time. And Bill actually came around to the idea that when we talk about God being timeless, it means he's beyond cosmic time,
Mm-hmm.
but not beyond all temporal experiences.
Okay.
So we take a too narrow of a definition of time.
Sure.
And I think Craig comes down on the view that before creation, God is timeless, but upon creation, he's timeful. He kind of takes a mediating
Mm-hmm. So he can
position.
interact with his creation.
That's his argument.
It doesn't limit his future knowledge because he can know all true facts
But it
and
does have the
counterfactuals.
difficulty. How does a Godhead interact with one another if they're not having some kind of temporal experiences?
Mm.
I mean, relationship.
Yeah.
These are challenges.
These are challenges, right?
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't all in the cosmic time.
In the end, I'm comfortable with knowing that my understanding has to be limited. That, I just can't picture what operating in 2 dimensions of time looks like. I can sketch out analogies, but really understanding that,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do the physics.
Yes,
and
and
I'm comfortable with my limitations there. Understanding that I don't understand it, but I probably couldn't understand what it really is.
yeah.
I wonder if that's the takeaway of, kind of general relativity and quantum mechanics and how does time work, is that God saying, there's this idea that, okay, we'll eventually get everything and we'll understand everything, and it's basically God's way of saying, nah.
No, it's not going to happen.
Right. But I
Get
think,
used to it.
but that's why you want to look as deep as you can. You
No,
go
I
all the way
agree.
down, and what if we found a purely mechanism answer? Oh wow, this is
No, actually,
this is
Jeff,
the
I think
super
we're gonna figure
variable.
that
If I
one
set
out.
the super variable, everything falls out. I haven't found that. I haven't found that super variable.
I personally think, and I think there's a good number of philosophers who would agree with me, I think God's relationship to time may be the most difficult issue in philosophy and theology.
Well, how can beings constrained to a single dimension of time come up with a complete definition of time?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean,
Mathematically.
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
These are big, these are tough.
Mm-hmm.